What if I told you that two sellers could agree to the exact same price, but one takes home $600,000 more than the other? Same deal, same business, same number on paper, but completely different outcome. The difference is deal structure, and almost nobody talks about it until it's too late. That's what we're talking about today on education. So for our business owners out there, they're looking at we talk a lot about operations and some of the metrics and everything, but everything's kind of gearing towards this exit path, right? So there's sometimes a lot of confusion, or sometimes just a lack of understanding about different components that go into an exit path and kind of the structure around that. So we're going to discuss some of that today. But so imagine you have a company you're selling for $3 million. By the time it's paid off, you're looking at that $3 million transaction value. But that's the reality is we're not taking all that home, right, Christian? So
got to pay Uncle Sam.
Yeah, there's Uncle Sam you got to pay. You may have some existing debt on the books you have to pay off. And then there's a lot of other hidden components too. We're going to talk a little bit about some escrow could be held back to cover potential warrants and covenants and different things in the legal structure of your exit. And then also, depending on how that structure was, we're going to go into a lot of earnout discussion today for the business owners out there. So a lot of that can actually get held back, or obviously be taken upfront off of there's advisory fees. You're more than likely going to be working with an M&A advisor or a business broker of some sort, and they're going to be taking their cut. So a lot of components take away from that top line purchase price number. So we're going to be diving into a little bit more of those details today. So we're going to go into three different deal structures, keeping it pretty simple in the three different ones, just as an illustrative aspect of how we sell our businesses. So first one we'll be getting into is cash at close, obviously the cleanest type of transaction. We'll go into a little bit of the specifics there, but then obviously with these smaller, lower middle market deals, there's going to be a lot more of seller financing and earnout structures being thrown in. So we're going to be spending most of our time on those last two. But starting with cash at close, so it's, again, pretty straightforward type of transaction, right? There's not a lot of things on the back end that are going into that, but it can be potentially more rare depending on the type of buyer you're dealing with. But it presumes that the buyer has pretty good access to financing, whether it's a strategic buyer that has good handle on financing. They have enough earnings built up in their company, and they have access to debt capital markets where they can help with that transaction. Obviously, if we're talking about transactions in the sub 5 million space, at least in terms of the debt component, the SBA 7A is a valid option, but also that can be a little bit difficult, especially if it's an individual buyer. Obviously, there's a lot of things from the buyer's standpoint that makes that a little difficult. They have to pledge, they have to personally guarantee the loan if they're over a 20% owner of the company they're taking over. So that can be a little difficult to do. And then there's obviously private equity as well, which obviously they have a committed pool of equity capital, and then those companies, those private equity firms, usually have relationships with banks as well that help make up the difference. But a lot of times those are going to be the ones that are also doing a lot of negotiating beyond just getting a clean transaction up front. They want to try to see what those guys are, they make their bread from negotiating, and usually want to try to find other ways to create value beyond just the front end of the transaction. So it can get a little bit more complicated than just a clean cash at close transaction, but it's still a common component that you may see. And also, if you're the seller, before we get into these last two structures, if you're willing to budge on your valuation, at least on and peg it down, if it's something we're going to be talking about kind of your interest in what you want your goals to be. But if you don't want to be somebody that's still staying involved with the company for the next couple of years, or you don't want to kind of deal with that potential headache and complexity of a transaction that could be drawn out a few years longer than the initial transaction date, or close date, you may be willing to say like, okay, I'm willing to peg down my valuation if it just means I get cash at close. So um, it's always something that can be negotiated, obviously, with your advisors, trying to figure out what makes most sense for you. But
Yeah,
if
really,
you,
in order to get these, you really have to have clean books. I mean, you both have an agreed upon valuation, so there's no gap, so there's no earnbacks. And obviously, as Stephen mentioned, you have to have strong financing from the buyer side. So that could be, personal cash, once again, the SBA, or some sort of institutional funding, whether it be PE or whomever. But I know we do have an example here, kind of a real world example for our listening audience. We have, a $4.2 million manufacturing business, 85% SBA finance, former ops executive buyer, a clean 60-day close. So that allowed them to put down, 15% on the actual cash portion for it, and then use the SBA to help close whatever it could be, and allowed the close to happen or occur a lot faster than sometimes it can. But usually, a lot of people like to do this if they are close to retirement, right, Stephen? Like if they really don't want to be
yeah,
a part of it. But in order to do so, you really have to make sure that you have kind of all of your affairs in order, and that your business is ready to be sold, because not everybody likes to deal with the headaches and find sort of the skeletons within the closet.
yeah. And if you're younger, or at least view yourself as having a couple more years of runway left, you might without having a the next phase of your life figured out, you may want to just stick around, because whatever that business is that you built, it's going to be probably the most valuable thing, at least up until that point, that you've done. So you may want to try to extract as much value from that as you can. So you may be willing to be along for the ride for a couple years longer beyond the transaction date. But for a lot of the older business owners that are really just looking as retirement as their next step, you may want to really see this cash at close. And a big thing that Christian had mentioned is you want to make sure that you've been doing the things that we've discussed in our previous shows and in our previous conferences, of making sure that your books are clean, you have your systems down and processes down. The more that you can do to show to the buyer that there's going to be a clean handoff and without much disruption in operations, the more credibility you can lend to that buyer, that you've put those necessary components in place, the less risk that they feel, that they would feel in buying the business with you leaving the company and taking it over post close. So a lot of things need to be happening in the build up to your exit to ensure that you can get the purchase price that you want and as much cash up front as you desire. So again, we have a lot of different resources about getting to that point, but ideally you've done those things, you've taken the necessary steps to get to this point of your exit, to where you're getting a clean transaction at close. But for those that aren't able to do that, or maybe you do need to bridge the gap in financing, we're going to go into our second type of transaction, which is the seller financing route. So seller financing, you may be pretty familiar with this, but you become the bank, right? So let's say there is a funding gap between the SBA loan that they're looking at getting. Maybe they can't get the full 85% of the transaction at close, or for whatever reason, they need to bridge that gap. And if you want to get the valuation you want, you may be willing to finance the rest, where they can bridge that valuation gap, and you would be subordinate more than likely to the the SBA loan, for example, or whatever type of senior debt you may be used to be a part of that transaction.
And what's kind of risky about this is the seller usually has skin in the game, because your business really depends upon the success of your departure. So to go back to what Steve was saying, within our past conversations, we want to bring that up one more time. The fact that, your business has to be dependable without you. And so if you get removed from this and we do some sort of sweetheart seller financing deal, and that business begins to tank with, we'll say Steven wants to purchase me. I step away from the business, and my business or former business starts to fail or not meet its benchmarks or certain quotas or whatever. That could really hurt the note and kind of the return I'm going to be getting on it. But typically these are, structured to be anywhere between, I know we have 3 to 7 years, but it can be shorter than that sometimes. But if the business fails, sometimes the note might not even be paid. Sometimes it can be paid less than what you were actually expected as far as an interest rate goes. So the quality really matters as much as the quality of your business and the quality of the seller both kind of matter here, because if the business is able to be operated without, for instance, me being there, and Steven's the one that comes in and let's say implements a bunch of things and that doesn't work, then that could also hurt me as well, because once again, I'm still the holder of that note. I am the bank. We do have a real world example. So a Pacific Northwest distribution center, they had 6.5 million in revenue. They did a seller financing plus a commercial loan. Expanded from 3 to 5 states within 8 months. So that does allow the actual purchaser to get a little bit of breathing room as well to be able to expand and help, improve the actual operations themselves. So who would you say would be pretty interested in these seller financing deals, Steven?
Yeah, so a lot of you can see it from a lot of different buyers. A lot of it depends again on how dependent upon you are into the company. I've seen private equity buyers try to get seller financing just as a way to, especially now with the PE firms aren't getting quite the same level of debt that they're may have been able to get in the past. As far as the overall, a bank may only be willing to do 3 to 4 turns of purchase equity, as far as the multiple of how much of that EBITDA multiple they can get leveraged with debt. So a lot of times, they may be looking at seller financing as a way to get their ideal capital structure as far as the debt side of that onto their business as they can. A lot of we talk to buyers we talk to business owners themselves that are still they're younger. There's an HVAC guy that we talk to. He bought his HVAC company principally through seller financing, and he's also trying to acquire other companies using that same model. So you will find that with some more, independent operators or small business operators that may not get it. They may not be generating enough earnings from their existing company to really do a full-on acquisition. Just through that, and maybe maybe they do have banking relationships, but it's not necessarily something they well, maybe that's just typically through a line of credit or whatever, and they don't necessarily want to go through the hassle. I mean, they're business owners; they're not wanting to deal with the process of an SBA loan when they have so many other things on their plate. Where if they can, have a nice, handshake, I don't want to say handshake deal, but face to face, let's get a deal done, work out some seller financing terms, see how much cash I can get at close, but let's, try to get, let's not deal with the additional complexity of bringing a bank into this. That's going to have its own, timeline and complexity. Or if we can just iron out a deal that makes sense, you trust me, I've been in your space for a while, let's just hash out a deal. So you could do something like that.
Actually, I know a couple of family businesses that do this as well. There's a person I know whose father built a business, sold it, and then he was helping his son actually find another manufacturing business, and so they set it up, whereas kind of he was the seller finance to the son to allow this to happen. But obviously your interest rates can change depending upon who you're dealing with, what the agreement comes to. I know some people say it goes anywhere between 5 to 8%. Those are really just to determine between both parties. It's not like a set kind of rate as if a bank would do this.
Yeah. And it's sort of, I would say ironic thing about it, but it's typically you would see a subordinate note being, a higher interest rate than, what the senior note would be. And it very well, you could structure it like that, but a lot of times the interest rate may be even less than the senior note, depending on the type of bank financing you're getting. because an SBA loan, for example, is probably in the high sevens right now, low eights, and you might be negotiating that seller financing at 6%. So even though you're lower in the totem pole as far as your you're subordinate to that senior debt, you may still more than likely take a a lower interest rate than what their senior debt might be. And again, that's really just to get the again to get the deal done. You were in your instance, you're more than likely focusing again on the actual principal value of that note as far as getting that valuation higher. And as long as that note is keeping pace or maybe a little bit better than inflation, you're getting that return. But another thing you want to be able to kind of understand is when that buyer, and understanding what that senior note is and how that could be playing into the cash flow of that company, and making sure that your subordinate note is in a way that isn't going to cash constrain that company going forward. So that could mean you may need to increase the duration of that seller note. We see 3 to 7 years as a typical one, but if that SBA note or whatever that senior loan is on top of your seller financing is potentially restrictive, if you're trying to do a 3-year term or duration, you may need to extend that period 4 to 5 to 4 or 5 years or longer, just to make sure that there's enough cash in the company to potentially handle a slight downturn, and make sure that there's money there for working capital and a little bit of growth on top of it. So things to consider as well when we talk about seller financing. And then for the last one, and something that's been getting a little bit more understood to buyers, but still a lot of lack of clarity, or it might be a little bit opaque, but it is a term that has been getting a little bit more into the spotlight for prospective sellers of their companies, is the concept of an earnout. So an earnout, similar ideas, seller financing, but again, even less, but the seller financing, if the company defaults, the company can still go back to you, and obviously you may not be looking to continue to run it, but there are some protections in place that they get wiped out, but you have a chance to recover. With an earnout, this is no longer considered dead, so you don't have any types of controls as far as a creditor is concerned, but you are getting paid out in a similar fashion typically. So, and again, this is a way to kind of smooth out a valuation gap. So for example, if a seller wants an 8x EBITDA multiple, but the buyer's only valuing a company at 5x, there's a way to bridge that gap where, if we're hitting targets and we're hitting where the growth we think should be able to get to, then
there's a chance
to get that
to catch up, essentially, and get that actual valuation.
Get that actual value, exactly. So you want to expand on that too, Christian?
Yeah, so most of the time these are measured, or at least the items that you're trying to measure on are like EBITDA. I think that's the most common one, right? And then you have revenue. Sometimes it could be specific milestones, but most of the time I think they use the EBITDA for this. But once you hit whatever milestone, that could equate to some sort of value that comes back to you as the seller. And it also kind of creates, different incentives for kind of both parties, which could be a little bit tricky to navigate with a lot of these, because obviously the buyer doesn't want to overpay and the seller definitely doesn't want to be underpaid. But, usually the seller negotiates the price, and then they negotiate away the control needed to hit the target post-close. So it's a pretty interesting process. I think we have a fact here from our production team that said that 33% of
33% of private M&A deals involved an earnout, and 43% of the earnout was 43% of the closing price was through an earnout. So that's a pretty high number, and again, it's being an increasingly utilized tool in these types of deal structures. So I don't think it would be uncommon to anticipate earnout, especially as obviously as Christian had mentioned, sellers want the best price, but highest price they can get. Buyers are trying to get obviously the lowest price, and this is typically the cleanest way to help bridge that gap, where it's a way to meet in the middle and help that negotiation come through. Where it's like, well, if you really truly believe you can hit the number, the valuation is worth this much, prove it out via an earnout, and if it doesn't hit, then as the buyer, I'm not having to pay that premium that you had wanted up front. So, and then again, if you do hit those targets and the buyer is obviously satisfied and they're willing to pay that additional price on the valuation over time, because the model proved itself out. So, it is important to a lot of people don't want it, but it's increasingly becoming a reality of these structures. So the best thing you can really do is making sure you have the right controls in place to make sure that how this earnout is being calculated, and you have a lot of proper controls in that, so that you're not. There are some horror stories. If you talk to business owners, you may, there's an HVAC company, a separate one than the one I just brought up, but they hear the term earnout and they get a little skittish, and they view it as something you can't really bank on. Mm-hmm. And and to some degree, he's right to have that thought. And obviously, if you're in an environment where you're talking to a lot of other former business owners that had exited and had dealt with that, some of them could have complaints about it. And the reality is maybe they just didn't have the right controls in place. So we're going to go over some of those things here in a moment. But especially as you're looking to get that valuation, obviously you want to get that number as high as you can get. Typically, this is going to be the route you have to entertain if you want to get that number, right?
Yeah, and one sort of comment I want to add is usually these earnout periods have like an inverse relationship with time. So you want these to be a little bit shorter, like 1 to 3 years. The longer the period, that just means that you're going to have more exposure to decisions that you can't no longer make because it's part of your agreement. So once again, you kind of want to be able to hit these numbers a little bit sooner than you would have later. So,
yeah. And again, as we talk about, the lead up to, selling and things you need to have heading up to that. We talk about, things like customer concentration risk. Obviously, if you had a customer that took up 15 to 20% of your business, obviously that's something that might get flagged, and if they leave, then obviously that's a huge value. That value can get wiped. So sometimes a lot of ways to help mitigate not just the risk of having an earnout provision in your sale, but also in the case you do have an earnout, doing what you can control in the lead up to the exit, in terms of making sure you have a very diversified customer base that isn't taking a large portion of your sales. Making sure, again, you have a strong team in place, management team, and having a solid foundation when you sell, so you're not dealing with because in the back of your mind, if you're confident in the value of the business, again, it's are you comfortable? How confident are you that there's not going to be a dip in sales? Because that's usually what the buyer is concerned about. Is you leave, there's some impact to the business. There's going to sales, and by process, earnings are going to dip, and all of a sudden, the company we had bought at a certain value is now we're taking a hit on that, and so we again need to try to bridge that gap. So the more things you can do to put in place that you prevent that type of thing from being a concern, and give you the confidence that this earnout should prove itself out, and I should be able to get that value. Again, try to get those steps set up in the lead up to the selling. But as far as controls, before we get into some of these definitions here, there's a couple different ways again to help mitigate that risk. So there's operating covenants, typically. So one thing you may want to consider is, make sure that, the company you sell, at least during the earnout period, is its own entity and isn't getting folded into something else, because, that might be a way that they could try to disguise, where earnings are coming from or where the revenue is coming from. So, a provision you may need to have is, this needs to stay as a standalone entity so that we can, properly monitor, the revenue, the EBITDA, and everything that goes into that, so that there's no way for whatever the earnout is pegged to can get misconstrued or whatever. So there's a few different other ones too, but to also hit on acceleration clauses. So this would be if let's say the company had it for 2 years, but then they had another buyer that wanted it. Well, now and they end up selling it. Well, let's say that you still had some earnout left. You'd want a clause in place that accelerates a full payoff of that earnout if that business were to get sold prematurely, before that earnout was expired. And then also, you need to have a dispute resolution process as well. So, typically that's, in advance, having a third party CPA that is either, auditing on an annual basis to make sure, because we're talking about, in some cases up to, millions of dollars in value that could be pegged to this. So obviously you need to make sure that you're, putting the right things in place that can prevent any disputes from occurring. And if they do, making sure you have the proper channels to help resolve those disputes. So you'll get a third party CPA involved, in whether that's, annual auditing of the numbers and the metrics that the earnout is tied to.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, if there's any other disputes, there's a resolution process, that can be handled by a third party. So just a few examples there. Obviously, when ideally you'll have an M&A advisor that may be able to discuss in more detail some of these things, but things to keep in mind, again, because these earnouts are increasingly prevalent. It's important to be able to know and control what you can control as you look into these structures. So we have some other definitions just for our listening audience, and Christian will go over.
6 terms that every owner must know before signing anything. Once again, please seek out legal counsel. These are just general ideas. Nothing of this is advice, but one of them, the first one is working capital peg. So buyer wants a fully funded business at close. The peg negotiation is where deals quietly gain or lose 50 to 500,000. Negotiate this before the LOI. The next one is quality of earnings, third-party validation that your EBITDA is real and repeatable. If you don't commission one, the buyer's QOE, which is quality of earnings, will be used instead. The next one is reps and warranties. Your contractual promises about the state of the business. Breaches trigger indemnification claims post-close. Know what you're signing. Escrow / holdbacks, 5 to 10% held post-close for 12 to 24 months to cover rep and warranty claims. That money is real and exists in limbo. Asset sales versus stock sale. So buyers prefer asset sales, clean liabilities. Sellers prefer stock sales, capital gains treatment. This one decision can be worth hundreds of thousands. Net proceeds, the one number and only number that matters. Price minus debt payoff, taxes, fees, escrow, and earnout risk. Model this before you sign an LOI. So once again, just want to state that these are kind of some good definitions to know. You should read more into these and, obviously seek out the appropriate counsel to understand it better, and always have a lawyer look over, or a qualified professional, I should say, look over any documents before you sign anything is a good idea. We'll go on to the next one, which is for our listening audience, we have a slide up here called the real negotiation. Every deal structure conversation is really about one thing: who carries the risk that the future doesn't match the projections. So we have 5 slides here. The first one is cash at close, which we discussed. Then you have seller financing, which is the one where the risk is shared, the seller stays economically connected, and then the earnout, which Stephen just did a phenomenal job of discussing. Then we have what's called the transition period. So buyer needs seller for 2 years. That is the pricing question. So for instance, if it's heavily based on an owner to stay and operate it, then you need to discuss when that transition is going to occur. I've seen transitions be as short as 6 months, and I've seen transitions that have been as long as 5 years. That's really kind of up to both parties to determine that. Asset versus stock. This is always negotiable. a CPA conversation before LOI can save you a lot of money, depending on how this should be structured. And really, I think one of the ideas that Steve and I really want to get through to you is this is a private transaction, so it is okay to be creative within structuring. There's really no set terms on how to do this. Like, for instance, you go to McDonald's, you buy a cheeseburger that's going to be $1 to $2. You're not going to be able to negotiate with them. It's just not going to happen. But if somebody comes and tries to buy your business, it's okay to be creative and think out of the box. And these are kind of the strategies that we're trying to at least give you, so you know what you can expect or what you can do to find that agreement.
Yeah, another thing, I mean, and these structures aren't set in stone. These are just different aspects. But I've seen deals that involved, cash at close, seller financing, and earnout. So, you can kind of toggle the levers in any one direction on these different transaction structures. So, a company may have, or a buyer may have, debt that they're bringing, maybe some cash that they're bringing to the transaction. There's a seller financing component and there's an earnout component. I've seen all three being implemented in a deal. So it's not so use that to your advantage, and especially if you are looking to increase the value. There's those trade-offs, right? Obviously, you can't have can't have everything you want, right? So everything's a negotiation in this, but there are advantages to and disadvantages to all these different mechanisms. It's just a matter of what your willingness is to, again, take on additional risk. But that means if everything goes well, you get a higher valuation at the end of it. So things to keep in mind, but don't let one don't put yourself in a box. Obviously, this is a very big stage in your career, your life. We're talking about a business that you've probably in some cases built over 10, 20 plus years. So obviously don't use these tools at your disposal, and again consult advisors as well as you look at your options. And then lastly, we're just going to go over a few questions again as we tie things up. So know your adjusted EBITDA, cold, owner normalized, add back adjusted. So that's your valuation anchor. So we didn't talk a whole lot about adjusted EBITDA, but basically, there's some things of the business that on your income statement that would be removed, if you were to sell to a buyer. So maybe there's obviously your salary would be an add back, for example, if they already have, let's say, especially if you were a passive, non-active owner of the company, but you still paid yourself a salary on top of the distributions from the company or dividends, that would be immediately added back to the EBITDA. There may be some overhead adjustments. Let's say they'd be incorporating that company to where either there may be some shared overhead, that could potentially be an adjusted an adjustment made to the EBITDA as well, where that would again add to the value of your company. There's a few different things depending on the type of buyer. Obviously, a strategic and a PE buyer may have different ways of viewing add backs depending on how it would be implemented into their company or portfolio. But something you want to understand pretty well. And then on the second one, clean financials for 3 years. No commingling or unexpected adjustments. Quality of earnings. Again, Christian had mentioned that earlier, but it's basically how well is your income statement being tied into your cash flow and your operating cash account, right? So ideally, there's no underutilized accounts or whatever. But cleanest thing would be one, maybe two cash accounts that you have with the bank. Everything's flowing through those things, and you have invoices that are being tied directly towards paid invoices that are tying directly into those bank accounts, so that every cash every cent is accounted for through those accounts and is being flowed through from those receivables and invoices. So so a proper quality of earnings auditing firm is going to find those spots of weakness, and that could it's another critical reason why you need to have ensure you have clean books and clean things. If you had been putting personal expenses into your through your company. It's something you see a lot. Obviously that does help with, your taxable income, but at the end of the day, that's something you want to be cleaning up, in the build up and lead up to a sale. Also, know your debt payoff number. If you had equipment financing, you may have had, maybe you bought a piece of real estate that you operate your company out of. You have to pay off that mortgage. You have to, pay off the various things that are, encumbering your company. So that's obviously going to be taken off the top of the company as you sell.
Yeah, debt's just kind of like your part of your green fees, I like to call it. You have debt, insurances, and taxes. Those are always your green fees. And when it comes to a business, it's when you're going to sell, it's now debt and taxes.
Again, this is especially with your accountant, your tax accountant, but understand your tax exposure, asset versus stock sale is certainly worth a conversation with your CPA before any LOI is signed. So we didn't get really large into that, but again, typically for potential litigation, or that's kind of the biggest reason why a buyer may go asset purchase is just, even if you don't think you have a lawsuit against you, that can always end up causing a deal going bad. If they do a share purchase, they buy the legal entity, and then all of a sudden there is a hidden liability or a hidden litigation that ends up being a huge, potentially a catastrophic type of event. So, but there's also tax consequences to that. We're not tax advisors, but obviously something to discuss with. There are a little bit of differences in capital gains taxes and how the the income from that is taxed. So something to definitely talk with your CPA advisor. And for the last two, decide your earnout floor. How much do you need at close, and what are you willing to leave contingent on performance? So obviously you have a floor number that you need to hit or want to hit. And if there's an aspirational number and you're comfortable with an earnout getting you there, because you're comfortable with how you've set things up and the lead up to the business sale, then obviously go for the largest number that you can. If it's something you want to avoid completely, like we said, maybe you're willing to take a lower valuation, but it ensures cash at close. You're able to wipe your hands, go off to your next venture or retirement, and just leave it at that. And then lastly, know what the business looks like without you. The buyer will ask. The more essential you are, the more the harder it is to sell at a premium. So again, another reason, with some of the resources we talk about and some of the other things we've, webinars and podcasts we've done in the past. Thing we constantly try to hit is try to getting yourself to a point where you're able to remove yourself from the business. That's going to enable a higher premium on your business. And again, if you are looking at an earnout for a higher valuation, you give yourself some more confidence that you're going to be able to hit that number, presuming you have the right controls in place. So, don't, but the more you need to stay on, again, especially if you need to hit that earnout number, and that typically might mean I have to stay to ensure this gets hit because this company is still dependent upon me. Obviously we want to try to avoid that headache in the lead up to that, but especially if you're somewhat of an urgent seller, you might have no other choice, especially if there is a number you need to hit, that you need to keep staying along for the ride so that you can hit that number.
That's what we always ask too. What does your business look like if you stepped away for 60 days, 30 days, even 3 days? That's something that you should write down and figure out what went wrong. But that's the end of our podcast. Just want to leave you with one last note. Most owners negotiate the price. The sophisticated ones negotiate the structure. So thank you for listening.